The milk clarification is great. For those who don't know, this is a way to essentially pull the solids out of a cocktail by curdling milk with typically citrus. It creates this really kind of like smooth and silky mouthfeel. You're left with this like clear, beautiful cocktail. It brings in that kind of viscosity, right? That viscosity that alcohol has inherently. We've had a ton of success doing milk clarification with non-alcoholic cocktails. And one of the cool things about this is that because you're pulling out the solids, you're actually creating more stability in the drink, where, your juice would only last you a day or two. A clarified non-alcoholic cocktail in the fridge can last, 2 to 3 weeks and still have all of its integrity intact.
A very good morning and good afternoon from wherever people are joining, and welcome to today's webinar. We have Nora Furst with us, who's also our regional and category ambassador for Bartender Spirits Award. And the topic that we are discussing today is on non-alcoholic spirits, and we're finding out the gaps, what exactly buyers are looking for, what is missing in the market, because there's a huge upscale and an upward growth in this category, and we definitely want brands to tap on the right opportunities to think and to understand from Nora, like what is working, what exactly buyers are looking for, where this entire direction is going in terms of non-alcohol spirits, and also touch base on what is consumers' take on this category and where are we heading. So, welcome, Nora. I know it's been a busy time for you as well. And before we start the webinar, we would love to know about you. Even though if it's written on the website, we would love to know how are you placed in the industry right now and where are you heading?
Thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to be here talking about this really just incredible, exciting category where there's just so much happening. A little bit about me. So I'm a bar owner in San Francisco. And I'm a partner in a consulting company where we do beverage, menu, cocktail consulting, and we also do education. We've consulted on, I think, 20 to 30 concepts globally. And we've also kind of focused in on non-alc as a really specific point of education. So we've done cocktail weeks, and this year we're going to be at Tales and BCB in Brooklyn, Bar Convent, Brooklyn, doing panels and seminars about non-alcoholic programming and positioning in the climate today. A little bit also just to share kind of my history in this category. I was the second hire for Seedlip back in 2016. Seedlip being kind of the first stake in the ground non-alcoholic spirit that launched from Ben Branson in the UK. So I started educating and being kind of a part of this movement almost 10 years ago, when it looked really different 10 years ago. I mean, so much has changed and evolved in just the recent history. It's been challenging and also really exciting to kind of be a part of this movement and see people wrap their arms around it.
Amazing. So we have been seeing a lot of people actually making noise, actually coming out and voicing it out and giving a very good push to this category, no matter we have seen it in UK, US. And I think that is something which is really, really interesting, that now people are exclusively talking about this category, not just mixing it up with the rest of the wine or spirits, but they're exclusively talking about what is this mindful drinking is all about, where exactly this customer base and this category is moving. So let's take up our questions that we have for you, Nora. And to start with is, what key factors do on-trade buyers consider when they select non-alc spirits for their menus?
There's many factors, as you might imagine, but I distilled this down a little bit into 4 of what I consider to be kind of the most important leaders of what people are thinking about when they're looking at non-alcoholic spirits. In no particular order. I'll start with price. Pricing is incredibly important, and I know that there's some other questions about that, and we'll get into some more of the nitty-gritty about pricing a little bit later. But positioning non-alcoholic cocktails on cocktail menus and understanding what a guest will pay for that cocktail And also kind of in the context of your other offerings on a menu. So are you line pricing with your alcoholic cocktails? Are you reducing the cost by, a couple bucks? Or is it an entirely its own pricing category? So we always want to make sure that we're paying attention to the price that we're paying for anything that we're buying, and particularly things that we're going to be using in volume and putting on the menu. Another factor is flavor and quality. Of course, this is hugely
Right.
important, particularly in let me think about the democratic way to say this, a category where there's a lot of inconsistency across the board in terms of quality of product, because there's just so many new things that are happening, right? So people are learning how to create these products. They're learning, about stability. They're learning about all of these different things. And so making sure that if we're going to put a product on the menu and we're going to make that commitment to the product, making sure that there's quality, that the flavors are going to be there, and that flavor is going to be consistent across multiple orders, across multiple years, right? Another really important factor is this liquid in the bottle something that is unique or novel, or something that I can't actually create myself behind my bar? So this is something I often am looking for in all of the products I use. But if it's something that we can pretty easily create, then we're probably not going to buy it. We're just going to do it in-house, right? If we can make a juniper tea, for
Correct.
instance. So we're always looking for something that's unique, something that has something like sticky or catchy to it that really is going to impact the program in a way that moves it forward. And then finally is name recognition. And again, this is in such a new category. This is something that is starting to kind of grow and build, where, consumers, in particular, are coming in and they're like, oh, I recognize this name on this bottle. I've seen it on the shelf at places of trust. I've seen it on other menus where I know that I've had it before in a cocktail and it tasted really great. So that's also something that we're starting to pay attention to as well.
So you have talked about pricing. You have talked about what's important for people to understand in terms of the positioning as well. So how can these brands position themselves? They are almost competing with the traditional cocktail list in any of the bars. So how they can just make sure that even though it's unique in the category itself, but how they can compete with these traditional cocktail lists?
Basically, like half of the seminars that we do, we focus half of our time on talking about menu placement and talk consumer perception, of these drinks, and how we present them in order to sort of level up and either be on the same level or even be kind of more exciting and more
More.
stimulating than the alcoholic cocktails.
Right.
And this is a little bit like existential, but for me, one of the biggest things is actually recognizing that this isn't a traditional spirit, right? So that like this has something that is different and that is going to act
True.
differently than a traditional gin or rum or whiskey or whatever. So, kind of like actually like leaning into that and saying, this isn't always going to be a one-for-one analog. In fact, it's often not going to be a one-for-one analog. We want to treat it with respect, and we want to care for it and showcase it in a way that actually amplifies it instead of just plugging it into all of our traditional cocktail specs. That is hugely important. And I love seeing menus where, you'll have, 12 cocktails that all have different alcoholic cocktail bases, and then there'll be an asterisk, and it's like, this is also available NA.
In non-alc, yeah.
Non-alc, which is, it's very cool.
True.
But
Right.
I get really excited when I see a menu where it's like, here's my 12 alcoholic cocktails, but here's 12 non-alcoholic cocktails that are totally different, super interesting,
Correct.
all have their own merits. And then sometimes, what I really like is when it'll be an asterisk on the non-alcoholic, and it's like, you can spike this with, an ounce of rum or an ounce of
Alcohol.
vodka. Yeah, which I think is really cool. It like brings in
Yes.
some flexibility. Also, I think these people who are making these non-alcoholic ingredients, they know what they're doing better than anybody else. And so coming in with storytelling, coming in with guidance, coming in with education to these accounts where there might not be much context for the product, right? Like it might be an account
Right.
who actually never had a non-alcoholic menu before. And so this might be, this is often kind of a new thing, a new ball game for a
Correct.
lot of us. So coming in and just saying, hey, listen, like here's the story, and like creating that relationship, and bringing in kind of a transparency about, what the product is, how it acts, the experience of creating it, and where you've seen it be successful and where you've seen it maybe not be quite so successful, and kind of just doing that storytelling and that sharing with the account can make a really big difference.
How important it's going to be branding and packaging in terms of influencing trade buyers. So you said that a good story has to be there. There has to be something which makes the menu also a little bit enticing to the consumer. How much do you think non any category has to level up or has to match a certain level of branding and packaging?
I sort of hate to say it a little bit, but I think it's hugely important. It is like,
Mm,
particularly obviously in the off-premise, right, in retail, it's becomes like very, very important for people to see a bottle on the shelf, respond to it, and see like design cues, see like bottle shape cues, like the fonts that people are using. All of these things are
right,
building context for something that doesn't have much of a pre-existing context, right? So if I walk into, a liquor store or a retail shop and I see a bottle and it looks kind of like a bottle of Aperol because there's like, similar style of font and the color's right, but it's a non-alcoholic aperitif, I've got a context built in because of
right.
that. Like I already understand, like it's meeting me in the middle. I'm already understanding what this is meant to do and its place in the sort of lexicon of all of these different. On-premise is interesting because the craft cocktail movement has basically created programming in most kind of top craft cocktail bars where people are batching. And what batching means, for those who don't know, is that we're, instead of, if somebody orders a daiquiri, instead of pulling up a bottle of rum, a bottle of lime, and a bottle of
Mm,
simple syrup, we're actually sometimes pre-batching the cocktail. So we're putting all of the ingredients together and then we're rebottling it and putting it into, a liter plain bottle and putting tape on it. And then it's just one pour, right? The bottle shape and the bottle branding, if it ends up on the menu, becomes kind of less important because it's actually just going to be going into a big container and then it's going to be
right.
getting. I will say, however, don't shoot yourself in the foot by making a bottle that doesn't fit in a speed rail. Like that is like a really
Mm, correct.
shape that like a pour spout can't fit into. If it's not a batched program, that's going to be something that like people are really going to push back on because it makes service nearly impossible if you're using bottles that
True.
like are ergonomic. But all of that being said, obviously like having that bottle stand out on a back bar is also important, right? So like kind of, those context and the cues are very, very important in retail. But when you're
Mm,
looking at a back bar and you're like, okay, well, the person sitting and looking at the back bar might not immediately recognize that or might not necessarily know what it is. But if it's compelling, if there's something about it that they respond to and they see it and they're like, what
catchy.
is
Yeah.
that? That kind of like sparks something, then that can be really meaningful for even just getting folks to kind of open up their eyes to something new.
What is your
So
opinion on can packaging? NA spirits in cans. Is that something which you see is working good for brands?
I will say I haven't had a lot of experience with straight spirits in cans. I know that there's some that exist out there.
Correct.
More of my experience with cans is with RTDs and kind of, drinks that are more or less composed. I will say in general, I love cans, right? They're
Mm,
lightweight, they're better
right.
for the environment. Like there's so many, they're like, they create more stability. There's so
Right.
many like really great things about using cans. On the back bar, on a home bar cart, like they don't quite have the appeal as glass,
True.
unfortunately. I think people still have in their minds like a can equals cheap, can equals like not as
Yeah.
quality. Even though I think
Right.
that there's a paradigm shift, like I think that is changing, but we're not quite there yet with spirits in particular. I
True.
think we'll get there, but we're just not quite yet.
Eventually. What are the biggest no's that you would say to any brand which is trying to enter, especially in the on-premise? So what would you say that this is strictly no and something which is not working?
One of the things that I've seen, over the last 10 years that doesn't always land is, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it's this idea that you can create a direct analog with these spirits. So coming in and saying, this is a non-alcoholic whiskey and it's going to act just like whiskey, and you can plug it in to whiskey cocktails and nobody's going to know the difference. That is just not true. Like it's just non-alcoholic drinks are never going to taste exactly like their
Same,
alcohol
the same,
counterparts
correct,
because they have alcohol in them. It's
correct,
just,
correct.
I
There's no
think
point in making this category if it's gonna,
right.
it was supposed, yes,
Right. This is again a little bit of kind of a loose generalization, but I often think about, kind of like the meat industry and the kind of vegetarian options, and thinking about how, is a veggie burger ever going to taste exactly like beef?
non-budget, yes,
Right. Like
true,
it could be close, and like it has gotten pretty close, but it's never going to be exactly the same. And that's fine.
right,
It doesn't need to be, right? Like
right,
I order more veggie burgers now than I order meat burgers because I like them better. I think they're better for me. So brands that are coming in and they're saying, this is going to be exactly like its alcoholic counterpart, it's never going to quite land. And
mm,
that's true of landing with the consumer, but it's also true of landing with the bar manager. And we've
right,
seen it time and again, and especially in the early days of working with Seedlip, when bar managers didn't have any context for non-alcoholic spirits, we were coming in and we were having to educate them on how to build their recipes to compensate for the lack of alcohol, right? Because alcohol has things like viscosity, it has things like some inherent sweetness sometimes, it has things
mm,
like burn or a tingle, right? So all of these things that like we need to then figure out ways to build into the recipes and there's a million different ways. And again, this is part of what we educate on, which is, building in mouthfeel, building in that
right.
tingle you can see if it's not already existing in the spirit itself. I guess that's one big no, is just having, making sure that you are elevating and treating your product with respect and not just saying
Not
this is
as an alternate, yeah,
exactly, this is a one for one. I think there's also, there's so much opportunity right now in this category for kind of a feedback loop, right? Because it's like
mm,
changing, it's growing, it's
correct,
expanding. And so I think, being open to hearing feedback about your product is hugely important. And that might not mean that like you're going to change it, or like it's not always going to be positive feedback. But one of the key things that I learned, especially again in early Seedlip days, I'd be walking into accounts and sometimes getting laughed out of the account because they're like, we don't want to spend $35 on a bottle of flavored water, right? Like you
mm,
have to hear that, and
true.
you have to recognize it and say thank you for thank you for sharing
For
your
the feed,
feedback.
yep,
Let me show you what we can do with this. Like let me demonstrate. And so I would walk around with the bottles, but I would also walk around with mixers and with pre-made cocktails. So I could actually
nice,
like demonstrate how the liquid works with tonic water, how it works in a, non-alcoholic brownie, for instance. Which is really just, you hear the feedback and then you kind of show them all of the different ways that they
true.
can use. Yeah.
I think it's more of an education gap as well. The more they will know how this category works, I think more they will feel close to the category. Are there specific cocktail trends or ingredients that pair exceptionally well with any spirits?
Yeah, I love this question
Nice.
because this is like I think really important. And I think that this is also this sort of learning curve that we're all on right now, is like how do we make these things translate to the consumer and translate to cocktail menus in a way that
Mm,
they hold their own against their alcoholic counterparts. And we were just Ankita and I were just chatting about it was in Delhi earlier last week in India, and there's so much creativity there in the cocktail scene. But
mm,
what people are liking to drink there, and we're seeing this worldwide, but it was like very potent in Delhi, where it's very concentrated and there's a
nice.
lot of really creative cocktail folks, is clarification, right? Is like cocktail
Mm,
basically like milk clarification, and then spicy cocktails. So spicy
Yes.
cocktails, which I touched on earlier, like this is a really great tool to kind of bring in that like alcohol burn, that alcohol heat, in a way that is, it's natural. It's not like super challenging. It's a very easy kind of like pop to make people who are having, let's call it a non-alcoholic margarita, to
Mm,
make it feel like a cocktail, to make it feel more sort of momentous, more occasion driven, and also to create, that slow sipping. And that's something that really so important in this category is like creating things that are delicious, but also that like
mm,
aren't necessarily chuggable, right? Because like you can,
true.
you could sit down and you could chug a glass of iced tea, but we want to
Yeah.
create something that's complex.
Experience.
That's an
Yes.
experience. Yeah, it has things that are like, going to slow you down a little bit, and like you're going to have it with your food, and you're going to have conversation and all of those different cool things that come with cocktails. The milk clarification is great because
Mm,
this is for those who don't know, this is a way to essentially pull the solids out of a cocktail by curdling milk with typically citrus. And it creates this really kind of like smooth and silky mouthfeel. You're left with this
mm,
like clear, beautiful cocktail. And it brings in that kind of viscosity, right? That viscosity that alcohol has inherently. We've had a ton of success doing milk clarification with non-alcoholic cocktails. And one of the cool things about this is that because you're pulling out the solids, you're actually creating more stability in the drink, where, your juice would only last you a day or two. A clarified non-alcoholic cocktail in the fridge can last, 2 to 3 weeks, and still have all of its integrity intact. And then the third thing I would say is this movement of bitter flavors in cocktails, which we've seen, I guess, probably in the last since like the early aughts, right? Like Fernet Branca came around, like Americans were like, oh my God, like Amaro is a thing, like this is really cool. People are like vermouth, like that's cool too. And like kind of embracing like aperitivo hour, right? Which is like
right.
aperitivo hour is like the sexiest like cocktail moment. And it's not really, I mean, it's about a spritz, it's about an Aperol spritz, but it's really about the moment. It's about like all the things about that moment. And so it's really easy to just kind of slot in a non-alcoholic option there. Bitter flavors are also, they're not something that is present in most like sodas, most juices,
Mm,
most of the like Shirley Temples of yore, right? Like they feel sophisticated, they feel different, they feel more adult, and also they're gonna make you drink your cocktail a little bit slower if it's got some bitterness. And it goes great with food or before food.
yes. Yeah. I was about to ask how about the food pairing, but yeah, looks like it goes well.
Yeah, absolutely.
How can an NA brand support bars in creating profitable, high quality NA cocktail?
Partnerships are number one. So
Mm,
this is about coming in, and having a open conversation about how best to partner with each other. This is I would say probably easier for smaller brands who can actually respond to that conversation and actually create a partnership
correct.
plan that's bespoke or that's potentially a little bit unique. When you get into these bigger companies, there's a little bit more of a cookie cutter approach, which isn't to say that like that's also not meaningful. It's very meaningful. But I think there's kind of this unique ability for these smaller, more nimble companies to come in and actually create a sort of a more organic partnership,
Mm,
uh, that has real legs to it, and will last. That partnership to me, it's about education, right? So we talked about that a little bit earlier. So making sure
yes.
that the account is understanding what this product is, that they're getting some information about how to use it and kind of other
How to
places that have
sell. Yes.
to sell it, other places that have been successful with it. There's other kinds of support. So there's, of course, like dollars support, there's menu support, there's coming in and
Mm,
hosting an event, which I always love because that's like a moment for
correct.
education. It's a moment to kind of build some walls around like what this product is and what it's doing at this bar or restaurant, and say, hey, this is the vibe of this thing, and we're going to
Correct.
create an sort of showcase its dynamics in 4 cocktails, and so people can come and experience it and taste it, in the best way possible. I think on the kind of beyond the conversation with the buyer, or with the account, There's consistency, which I talked about before, is hugely important. So making sure that, if you are kind of in a development phase, but you've gone to market already, and there's going to be some consistency issues, just being transparent about that and like letting
Hmm.
folks know that, this is version one, this is version two.
Correct.
We've seen it a surprising amount of inconsistencies across NA.
Hmm.
And I think part of that is like it's, there's also a stability thing, right? So there's kind of, folks are understanding how their product acts after a year on the shelf or after 2 years on the shelf. Like
Interesting. Hmm.
if it sits out uncapped for, a week and it's 80 degrees and 90% humidity, like it might ferment, and like that can be really
Wow.
scary. You know what I mean? Like
True.
that's not a good thing for a non-alcoholic product. So, I think just having kind of transparent dialogue about that, because if many of these bars and restaurants, when they're bringing a product in, it's long term. It's not just, kind of throwing something on the shelf
Correct.
for like really about like incorporating it deeply into their programming. Again, like in this category, there's been so much growth and expansion that we've seen these makers expand their line of SKUs really rapidly. So,
Hmm.
they'll start with a core four maybe, or even a core two, and then suddenly, 6 months later, there's like 24 different SKUs, and some of them are good and some of them are maybe not so good, and you're like,
Hmm.
what is happening? So I think, there's sort of this like staying true to the vision of like who they are and what they're doing and their place in the market. It helps bars and restaurants to kind of keep that relationship sacred and like continue to support and believe in that brand, because they're clearly supporting and believing in themselves, by kind of staying true to this, whatever their vision is. Again, I mentioned this already, but just the responding to feedback. So hearing feedback about how things are working out, once they've been placed on menu, having that moment of follow-up is hugely important.
What's missing in the current NA spirits market that buyers are actively looking for?
Yeah, this question is hard for me because I
Hmm.
feel like every time I open my phone, there's a new product out there. And so there's so much happening that I don't actually see like a huge gaping hole anywhere. I think
Hmm.
that people are, there's a lot of kind of just like throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Hmm.
I guess one of the things that I wish there was more of, let's put it that way, is products that have a highly concentrated flavor, that are piquant in such that they can carry flavor with just an ounce in a cocktail that might contain, passion fruit and lime juice and, all of
Yes.
these other like intense flavors that are kind of competing. So, having a product that we can treat in a similar way, ritually, that we would, a bottle of traditional spirits, just in terms of its flavor concentration, like that, I think that is hugely important. We don't always see that. We're often having to use 4 or 5 ounces, or, what have you. Consistency is key. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but like that
Yeah.
is hugely important. I think there's a lot of space in this kind of bitter profile, right? I think that, we've seen some really cool products come out in the last couple years that are leaning into that. But that bittering thing is something that not a lot of bars are equipped to develop on their own.
Hmm.
It's something that has that really kind of easy moment of like that aperitivo hour, that thing where people kind of understand the occasion for a bitter cocktail. And also bitter flavors extract really well in water. So if you're using whole ingredients, like those flavors, like they work really well without alcohol.
Right.
And that being said, I guess, another really important thing is seeing products that aren't made in flavor houses, that are using whole ingredients. Like that's always really exciting to see folks that are kind of doing it from scratch and doing it from the ground up.
How can NA brands navigate and expand in international markets while dealing with shifting trade policy and regulatory challenges? So it's all about that how they can deal with this hostile trade environment that we are seeing.
Yeah, oh my God. I like I don't even know where to begin with this one. And I wish I had the answer for this, but I don't know that I do. It is gonna be wild to see what happens with these all of this stuff that's going on right now. And I'm not excited about it. Being in the non-alc category, because there's so much regulation, and I'll speak specifically
Hmm.
about this because that's what I know the best, but there's regulation around alcohol, right? So like products that contain alcohol, like you can't, there's so many things, there's so many laws, there's so many like
Correct.
all of, and to have a product that is non-alcoholic, like suddenly it's a very different ball game, right? Like, I mean, you're dealing with like food and, you're dealing
Food
with
and right.
food regulations.
Correct.
You can, there's a lot of loopholes and there's a lot of things that traditional alcoholic brands can't do, right? Like
Hmm.
you could literally like walk into a bar with a bottle, well, I'll speak for California, with a bottle of non-alcoholic spirits and like pay the bartender to like put it on the shelf, right? You shouldn't do that, but you could. Whereas, if you had a bottle of vodka, like that is a huge no-no. You cannot do that.
Correct.
I think maybe, keeping an eye on that and being like, things are going to get really wacky and really bad probably for a little while with trade, but we do have this ability to kind of be nimble and be flexible in ways that like the alcohol industry cannot. And so there's kind of a leg up there, right? And like
Hmm.
maybe leaning into those options could be really, really helpful.
I think it's important for brands also to see which market can work for them and which market they can just avoid for a while. I think that could be a game changer.
Absolutely. I think having a regional focus and actually like to your point, like leaning
Right.
into, and really kind of expanding and digging your heels into maybe it's your local market or maybe it's just a
Hmm.
specific market. That's huge. And because we're on our phones all day long and we're on social media and most people that are excited about cocktails are paying attention to what's happening in the global market
Right.
and
Right.
we'll get excited about it. And then when it's the time for it to come to San Francisco, for instance, we're already like salivating and ready for it.
True. True. All right. So we have the question of the hour. With ongoing tariff uncertainties, how should any brand price and position themselves in the market?
I think relationships are number one.
Hmm.
And I know we talked a little bit about distribution. Finding a really good distributor partner
Hmm.
is really important. When we first took Seedlip to market in the US, we were actually working with a food distributor, like kind of a boutique food distributor that sold like truffles and caviar and stuff. And so it was strategic in a way that we were actually like going to Michelin starred restaurants because that was who the distributor was working with. And so we were
Hmm.
sort of tapping into that halo first. And then we sort of trickled out and ended up partnering with kind of more traditional spirits distributors. But, there's also, in California, a non-alcoholic product can work with multiple distributors too. So they don't always love that, but there's an
Hmm.
opportunity to potentially work with
This
a
one,
food
correct.
and have some diversity in that portfolio.
True.
I think, we've also seen all kinds of shifts and changes in distributorship and especially, what's been happening to kind of overall alcohol revenue, nationwide over the last 2 years, which is a big dip, which is, I think part of why this is also an exciting conversation because people are drinking less alcohol, they're drinking more non-alcoholic cocktails. But, just making sure that there's, that stability with the distributor is becomes very ingrained with your buyers, right? So like
Hmm.
that shifts, they get all like confused.
True.
And so, I think just digging your heels into the relationships, not only with the buyers, but also with the distributors. And if you need to
Hmm.
create diversity in that in order to like, maintain that stability, that becomes hugely important as well. In terms of pricing, we kind of always shoot for under $1 an ounce for our cocktail programs. This is, obviously varies, and I can't speak for the entire industry. But it's a pretty kind of pretty good default standard is if we can keep the liquid under $1 an ounce, our COGS should shake out. okay. So, I think if if you have kind of a more premium product, and it's riding that line, figuring out a way to, make
Hmm.
sure that you can drive it down, even if it's not, even if it's
Right.
not front line, but, maybe creating some kind of, built-in deals with your distributor, or having, a relationship with the account to where you're supporting in other ways that helps to kind of boost their COGS and get that pricing down so that they can, it's not something that's going to throw their P&L off at the end of the month, that they can actually keep it on, and their sustainability in that placement for them, right? So that financial sustainability is really important. And if you can lock that in, then great, that'll help you stay on the menu.
Just adding to this, Nora, what are the distribution strategies that you have seen is working well with NA? Is it more D2C, or do you what according to you is something that works or is working well?
Traditional cocktail bars are used to working with traditional spirits vendors. And so
Mm.
if you ask them, so for instance, going back to the story I was telling about this sort of boutique food distributor, like I couldn't go into like, a high volume craft cocktail bar that doesn't have a food program and be like, hey, set up an account with, this weird thing just so you can order this other weird thing that like you don't have much, context for.
Right.
Having the relationship with a more traditional spirits distributor that is already working with, some of your target account list is very important. And that's a great kind of foot in the door of just being able to, have it's reaching across the aisle and just
Mm.
being able to be like, hey, like we've done half the work for you. You already have an account set up, you already have terms. Like
Correct.
all you need to do is just like add one more item to your order list. That being said, we've also seen this happen where some of these new products and these new brands get lost in those portfolios because
Mm.
for any number of reasons, but I think often because the reps, they don't have as much awareness of the brands. Maybe they're not as educated about how to use these, and so they're kind of just like, I'm not going to work on selling these because I don't really get it, and like I'm making my money off of Tito's, so like that's what I'm going to
Mm.
focus on. Creating a distributor kind of education program is also hugely important. Making sure that there's reps that are invested and are kind of bought to the product, in whatever capacity, whether that's setting up, bonus programs or, whatever that might look like, is also hugely important. And, I think there is a moment for D2C also, like,
Yeah.
I'm speaking mostly to the on-premise because that's what I know.
Yes.
Because of their, the kind of diminished regulations
Mm.
on gifting, on sampling, and on all of these things, like there's a lot more flexibility in terms of what we can do with non-alcoholic spirits and how we can get them to people and how we can get that liquid into their hands and into their mouths ultimately. So, for me, like one of the biggest things is literally just like getting this liquid out to people. And, I do think it's very important to also showcase its flexibility. So maybe that means,
Right.
sending a sample bottle, but also like, here's a little sample of a cocktail also.
Correct.
So you can
Correct.
see,
I think that makes more sense. Yes.
totally. And a lot of these liquids, like they're excellent in cocktails, but like maybe they don't translate as well on their own. So
Right.
you need to have a moment to where you can share people on the liquid itself, but also like on how
Yeah.
it
What?
acts.
How the? Yeah. Correct. How the output is. Just one thing. So, for example, if there's an NA brand who's looking for a distributor, where do you think they should divert more to a distributor who already have an NA brand and knows how to work and knows all the placement? But in that way, you're kind of competing with other NA brands, or you should go for a distributor that has a gap in its portfolio where he would like to diversify. So, what would you do if you are a let's say a new and an existing NA brand?
Yeah, I think I would go with the latter, honestly. I feel like
Mm.
if if you're a portfolio and you don't have a non-alcoholic product or a non-alcoholic program, you need one like now, like you need one yesterday.
Right.
So to
Right.
be able to kind of be the first in that portfolio and be able to kind of educate on the category, in your own way, especially like leading and centering around your product is a plus, right? Like that's a bonus to
Mm.
have that kind of like
Right.
that first step in. Um, all of that to be said, like there's obviously pros to the other scenario in which there's, you're coming in and there's already been education and there's already, so it's, it's a lighter lift. But then to your
Right.
point, right, like you're competing with, another number of
Right.
SKUs. And so, people start to kind of get lost in the fray.